Hi, I'm Betty Webb here at the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, but I am talking to Josh Pomare, who lives in Melbourne, but who was born in New Zealand, correct?
Correct. Hello.
Correct. And on a horse farm.
That's right. My
That's
dad's
right.
a horse
I
trainer.
was I was born on a horse farm too, but ours was in Missouri.
Ah, there
So
we
what kind of horses?
go. So just train like thoroughbred racehorses, and we had sort of a lifestyle farm as well. We had
Oh,
a few lamb and chickens, and at some stage we had a few pigs. But yeah, it's far from the country life now in the middle of Melbourne City.
yeah, okay. Well, we're not here to talk about our childhoods on the farm, cleaning out the stalls, which is always a fun thing to do. Um, but you have got a book out called In the Clearing.
Correct.
And when Barbara Peters of the Poison Pen Bookstore called me up, she says, Betty, you're all about cults. You've got to read this book. So I did. I read the book, and I'm telling you, it blew my mind. And I'm going to be very careful and not talk too much about the wild reveal you give us, say about halfway, 3/4 of the way through the book. So I'm going to be very careful about that. So don't worry. But anyway, the reason Barbara wanted me here is because I also wrote a book, two books actually, about Arizona's cults. We've got polygamy cults out here. We've got, this old geezer who likes sex with 12-year-olds and films it. And that was considered for quite a time to be perfectly fine. However, after I started looking into it, I was still a journalist at the paper at the time. Once it came to the attention of the powers that be and the FBI, that was not quite so fine. So I want to know, your book is about a cult which is called, I think, let's see, it's termed two different ways, sometimes by, I think, Black Marsh, and then the other times it's called The Clearing. So I want you to tell me a little bit about, and I'll admit it, I'm starting this interview by asking you the very question authors get questioned every single time. So here it comes. What gave you the idea for that book?
Yeah. I mean, I don't mind this question. With my other books, I do, because they're completely fiction.
Yeah,
there's no sort of seed of the story to grow out
yeah,
from. There's all sorts of things. So, but with this, there really is a sort of pretty clear moment in time that I learned about and began to research a cult that was prominent in Australia in the well, really from the late 60s through to the early 90s. They were active, but at their peak, I guess, in the 70s and early 80s. And so this cult was called The Family, and they're famous for a lot of things, but the most interesting aspect of it for me was the fact, well, two things: the fact it was founded and led by a woman,
yeah,
which at the time was pretty remarkable. This is the era that gave us sort of Jim Jones and characters
right.
like that. And so, yeah, I found that really fascinating, that sort of free love sort of period in time, where we had this woman, Anna Hamilton Byrne was her name, who rose to prominence and sort of started this cult. The second thing that really interested me and inspired me was the type of people that were attracted to this organization, this cult. We're not talking about free love types necessarily. We're not talking about those disillusioned with society, hoping to escape communism or sort of this war-centric, this machine, that everyone was sort of rebelling against in the 60s and 70s. No, they were actually academics largely. They're really sophisticated types, upper middle class people in Melbourne. Lots of psychologists, medical professionals, politicians, and lawyers, and so on and so forth. So I thought this is a really fascinating cult. There's not much that I've read about other cults that sort of parallel these kind of aspects. And so I was reading quite heavily into this cult, and I found that Julian Assange, for instance, at one point in time was involved in this cult as a child. They all bleached their hair blonde like the children of the corn. So it was there's just so much that was so fascinating, and there was also so many unanswered questions, because by this stage, Anne Hamilton Byrne, the founder and leader, had dementia. So all these things, all these mysteries and things sort of disappeared. There were so many questions I had. So I sought to answer those questions myself by fictionalizing the story. Yeah.
Well, I noticed that the cult in I think your cult was probably a lot more probably much more harmful than the cult that you were writing about. But I did notice that there were two things that were the same, headed by a woman, and this woman's name was let's see, started with an A, Adrian.
Yeah, Adrian, correct. Yeah.
Mother Adrian, and then also the children also had their hair dyed or bleached blonde, and which was odd. There was another thing that fascinated me, knowing cults as I do. They're usually very much followed instructions, obey the orders, don't think for yourself. But for some reason, Adrian believes in creativity. And she even has one of the major characters, Amy, given art lessons by a famous artist. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so if I were to talk about the family, the inspiration for the cult, there was a real focus on education of the children. So there were ideals that they had to sort of adhere to, including physical standards of beauty. They all had to sort of look like Adrian, and she probably, I mean, she was in effect a white supremacist in a sense, because her standards of beauty and all of the members were Caucasian or white Australians. So, but they also had, certain kind of Aryan ideals, like the blonde hair. They were all quite pale. They also they were basically starved to be very small and petite and skinny. But part of those ideals came from this idea of education and being prepared for the new world or the new era sort of thing. So the education was actually a really high standard. They weren't taught things that you'd find ordinarily on the Australian curriculum, but they were educated, and they had guest speakers come in and talk to them about certain things, and these people often were from universities. And they did have, because I don't know if they were funded or if it was a sort of legal requirement, but to be homeschooled, I think someone will come in and check in on you. And so occasionally someone from the government would come in and check in on them to make sure that the education was to the highest, or was at a certain level that was acceptable. And they always found that the children were actually very clever and were actually, very well educated. And so I sort of played on that, and I thought, there were artists involved in the family, and I thought that could be a fun way to, if you've read the story, you realize it's not fun, but as a writer, it is always fun to bring in a kind of artist to, for lack of a better word, sort of lampoon a little bit, because, that artists do take themselves very seriously. And so, so this artist comes in and essentially helps to train her up in art, and obviously it ends a certain way. I don't want to give away spoilers, but it doesn't end well for one of the characters in this instance.
Okay, what I'm going to do now, so the rest of this conversation is going to make some sense. I am going to just kind of read a little summation of the plot, because although this is not, in a way, it's plot oriented, but it's much more character oriented than this sort of book. So, all right, briefly. In the Clearing is about an Australian cult called Black Marsh, which is sometimes referred to as the Clearing. The cult, and this is the one that got me, the cult increases its number by kidnapping young children and brainwashing them into accepting the cult's bizarre beliefs. And they are bizarre because Adrian, the leader of the cult, believes she is the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and which is quite something. So the book is told mainly in the voice of two different characters. There's Amy, she's a young girl who's been raised in the cult, and she's currently helping kidnap a new child. But the story's also told by Freya, a 39-year-old yoga teacher not in the cult, who in her fear of the outside world has barricaded herself in her house with her 7-year-old son, Billy. Unfortunately, Freya and Billy's house is near the land occupied by the Black Marsh cult. And now, every now and then, you throw in the third voice, and that's by a person, don't know boy or girl, man or woman at this point, of a mysterious person called the Watcher, who is spying on Freya and Billy. One question I have to, why did you tell the story from mainly the points of view of Amy and Freya? Because with the political stance these days, sometimes females are hesitant to read a book about women from supposedly a women's voice written by a man. And I tend to be one of them. And so when I picked up your book, I just saw your initials and then your last name. And I thought, good, it's a feminist book written by a woman. But then I got to it and I started reading and I thought, wait a minute, this is a guy when I looked you up. And did it take a certain amount of courage? I hear your first book was told from a female point of view. Why did you make these kinds of choices, knowing you might get stomped on by some political people?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's one I feel not a lot, but I do get this question, and I do understand and fully appreciate criticism directed at often at men writing a woman's perspective, but also I think people writing outside of their own experience will likely open themselves up to criticism, particularly if it's done poorly or if there are issues with representation in the space that they're occupying. So I'm on board and I'm really open to these conversations. And I'll also preface by saying I am hoping if I do get it wrong, or if there's anything that's not working, that it's addressed and that it's brought to my attention. But yeah, and saying that, the space really that I'm writing into is, and more so as I write more, is more commercial fiction. And whether or not that makes a difference, and whether or not the themes I'm writing to makes a difference, I can't be the one to make that judgment. But what makes me feel comfortable about writing from this perspective is the involvement of basically all the women in my life, including my wife, but my editorial team. And I think it's also just coming to it with an open mind and asking questions at every stage and making sure that at least in the editorial process and in the creation of these works, that we're getting it right. And so that's one part of the question, I suppose, is are you representing a woman's experience in an authentic way? And again, that's not for me to judge, but I hope that if I'm not, that we are addressing it at the editorial stage and when these early conversations are happening. The second part of that question, I guess, would be about representation in commercial fiction. Am I occupying a space that perhaps would be better occupied by a woman? And I think if you look at it in regards to entertainment, then I think the answer would probably likely be no. Certainly in Australia, my home territory, I think if I were trying to write about in a less entertainment sort of way, I think then I would feel more uncomfortable about it. In saying that, I have tried to the novel I'm currently working on editing, I've really tried to write from a male perspective. But it's just it's just too easy as a man in the world, unless I'm writing like detective fiction, or unless I'm writing, you know, I don't know, a war story or something. I just feel like it's too easy for me, and it's too hard to generate an interesting story, because below the surface there isn't as much sort of tension, there isn't as much to explore, and yeah, so I really gave up on that, and I tried and tried and tried, and now there are some chapters from a male perspective and some from a female perspective in my latest in my novel that's out next year. But I still find when I'm writing, the most interesting parts and the most satisfying parts are still the parts I write from a female perspective.
It works in your particular case. It definitely works. I'm one of these people who watches male writers very carefully when they're writing from a woman's point of view, because it's so often done very, very badly. I think you did a terrific job. I mean, because both Amy and Freya are fabulous characters. They've got a lot of depth, they've got a lot of layers. And which is the layer thing is what so often male writers get wrong about women. They just see the outer layer and they don't look beneath that. You look beneath it. And in fact, you don't just give it a glancing look. I mean, you are there. And I thought it was fantastic. Now, another thing that, oh boy, and how I even bring this up is going to be, okay, about halfway or third or 3/4 of the way through the book, you change it incredibly. There is everything you've believed about your characters turns out to be wrong. And I'm trying to figure out how in the world you did that. Was it something that occurred to you at the very beginning, or after at 3 a.m. after you've downed a quart of vodka?
It actually, oddly enough, it was, I mean, we talked about inspiration earlier. I also think when you're editing, you're seeking to unlock the potential of the story. And so much of that happens for me in a structural sense. So I'm a real structure junkie. And I think, and so really, if you tell the story in a simple way without any twists, there's a very clear kind of structure to it. It's very, you know, there's no great surprises, but it might be an interesting story or a gripping story or whatever. But for me, at one stage, I think it was probably after 3 or 4 drafts when I thought, what can I do here? Because it's working, but I want to really ratchet up the tension. I really want to sort of turn it on its head and subvert, you know, the reader's expectations fully. And so I just, yeah, I don't know what it was. I think I saw, it might have been an old TV show or something, or I can't remember where this particular thing came from, but I thought, hey, that works, that could work. And so it was just a case of untangling everything and putting it together, and kind of, you know, it's really difficult to talk about without giving that twist away. But
Right, I know.
yeah, it just sort of, I guess it was a combination of things. But I occasionally I'll do classes and teach creative writing and do workshops. And when we do talk about twists, I always say, write down a list of everything that the reader would assume to be true, and see which one of those you can subvert. And I guess it was something like that. I was thinking of the things that you know to be true, that you expect, that are just a given, and then it was just a case of subverting it.
Yeah, it was very subversive. And it just, I had a hard time for a while after that, because I had all of these expectations and you led me along for a while. And then you just stomped the bloody hell out of them. So it was, and I love it when a writer can do that. It was just marvelous. And I'm telling everybody about the book, because it was just, and I tend to be a pretty hard critic of cult books, because I've had, well, when I was writing the stories about the newspaper stories about our cult here, the polygamists, I was up there quite a bit. And I would say that probably most male writers, when they are writing about females in cults, get it wrong. They get it really wrong. You did not. You did not. And you mentioned that that you sometimes talk to your wife about some of your ideas and let her look at your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So she's not physically in the room with me most of the time, but she's always in the room with me in a sense that
Yeah.
I write with an open door, which is sort of, the opposite to many writers. They say write with a closed door, edit with an open door. Whereas my writing process, I tend to allow one or two other voices in with me early-ish on, and so it's just that question, is this something? Is this working? How do you feel about this idea? And so even again, it's almost a superstitious thing with certain writers won't even tell people their ideas until they've written the first draft. And I get that. And I think that's, if that works for some writers, I absolutely encourage everyone to try it that way. But for me, I have so many terrible ideas that I need to discount those early on. So I will often talk to my wife quite early on. One of my very first readers is my mother-in-law, who will also generally read my very early drafts at the same time as my editors. And that's because I think also within the industry, you lose a bit of perspective. You can do anyway. And I think it's important to have a reader who's not a writer to say, this isn't working, I don't like this. And so my first two readers tend to be my wife and my mother-in-law. And then from there, obviously, my editors begin to give me feedback. But I think it is just that thing of having an open door really early on. And just even with my first novel, it was just, my wife was reading it and she was feeling creeped out because there were certain things that she's like, it's like, how did you know that's what it's like? And one of the things was when you pull on tights and you haven't shaved your legs for a week or so, and you feel the sort of prickle of it. And so she's like, how did you know that? And I was like, well, I shaved my legs and I pulled on tights and to see. So there's sort of a combination there. And those conversations, like I said, I like to have them pretty early, and I like to method write as much as I can as well. And so, yeah, it's obviously our relationship probably comes across as quite strange at the moment, but it is just being really honest and open really early on in the process.
What did she think about that big turnaround that you did?
Say again, sorry, I missed that.
What did your wife think about that big turnaround, that major change in your story?
Well, the funny thing is, she had read an earlier draft where it didn't happen. And so, well, it did happen, but not in that sort of way. You knew very early on what the twist was. So, yeah, so it was, I think she even said, oh, no one's going to buy that. That's not going to work. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, da, da, da. And so she gave me all this feedback. And then I went in, and that really helped. And I thought, well, she's kind of right. She's seen both sides of it. So, yeah, it was just, and again, you're so close to the work, and I certainly am when I write. I'm far too close to the work to be truly objective, of course. And so I think I can get away with more than I can. And she's really prepared to say, no, that's not working. You need to do this or that. But yeah, it's funny because for a period there, I was like, you're right, I'm going to have to probably cut it. And then my editor's like, we're not cutting that. So yeah, it was kind of a funny sort of tug of war for a second there.
Well, I was enjoying the book before that. And then when you did that, I loved the book. And because you did not go where I thought you were going to go. I mean, readers who read a lot, like I do, I go through about 3 books a week, and which is why I wear glasses all the time. And when you read a certain genre, say, you tend to know where a writer is going. And what will make the book for you when you know where the book is going, what makes the book for you is the elegance of the prose. Okay, but not the big surprises. You, I feel, have a very elegant turn of phrase. I think your writing is much more close to literary than I would say suspense. Although the suspense is, oh boy, is it there. In one scene, I do have to mention this. I'm not giving away a big secret. Somebody gets their fingers chopped off with an axe. And so you give us those, but at the same time, you give us some darn good writing, which I really appreciated. And then, of course, I fell in love with totally in love with the book once the major event happened, the major change happened. But, you mentioned that drafts. How many drafts do you generally go to when you write a book?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for those really kind words. I mean, it's funny because I think on this it was one, and I think this happens for every writer once every, I don't know how often because I haven't written enough books to say, but it's only happened for me once, where you write the book and you're happy with early drafts. Because I don't know many writers that'll go after one or two drafts, go, oh, I love this.
Oh,
I feel like it goes the other way. The more you work on it, the more you hate it. And that's certainly been my experience with my debut, Call Me Evie, and the project I'm working on at the moment has been, it's been a couple of years of essentially changing the entire story every 6 or so months. And so it's getting to crunch time now where I'm reasonably happy with the story, but we're still really working on it. And so if you were to ask me how many drafts I've done, it could be 20 to 30, and all with major changes. And there's been times where I've done a draft and sent it off and had brutal feedback saying, let's go back to the previous draft and have another crack at it. So, and I've even said, as I've sent it off, I don't like this, it's not working. You need to tell me what's going wrong here. So, it's within the clearing, I think it was probably before we just started doing line edits, it was probably only maybe 5 or 6, maybe a couple more. Maybe I have my rose tinted glasses on, but I don't think it was any more than say 7 or 8 drafts from conception to when it was ready to be published. In fact, I had it ready to go essentially before my debut came out. I actually had it ready, and we had to wait, a year and a half, as is common practice. You obviously can't just go pushing out a book every 6 months. But I had it ready to go before my debut was published because it came out so easily. And now I've had 2.5 years or so since then to try knock out this next one, and it's been a real slog. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like the only answer and the only right answer to this question is I do as many drafts as it takes for me to get to the point where I go, I'd be happy for readers to read this.
Yeah. And then that could be anywhere from 4 to 20, apparently.
Yeah.
That's all very sad. I can see people at home who are thinking about, I want to be a writer. When you say 30 drafts, I don't know about that.
And
because that means you have to be questioning yourself all the time, and who wants to do that?
Yeah, it's been a tough couple of years on this, and I've had little breaks where I've written short stories and novellas and a couple of other projects. In fact, I've had a novella published here in Australia in between these two to buy some time. So we actually pushed it back 9 months, and we've published a novella which will be out in December this year. So yeah, there's been lots and lots of setbacks. But like I said, I've always been really happy with the concept of the story, and it's just a matter of finding the best way to tell this very simple. What is a very simple story? And it's the same within the clearing. It was just a matter of finding the narrative structure, finding the characters, finding the plot that's going to make this concept or this sort of story work.
What is the name of your new book that you're working on?
So it's called The Last Guest. So it's it'll be out over there at this stage, I think next September. Yeah. So if you, it's on. I think the cover and stuff should be online soon on Goodreads and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's not. I think we're starting to look at promoting a little bit more now that we're getting more confident the book will actually be finished in time.
You had mentioned in one interview that I saw with you that the name of In the Clearing, that was not your first choice. What are some of the choices that you made for the book at first? Yeah,
it's funny because I think every writer goes through this. You think you're much more literary than you are, and so I had these titles that you were never going to work for this sort of story, but one of them was called The Seed and the Sower. One of them was Dust You Shall Eat, which was a sort of biblical reference. What were some other ones? There were a few. There were a whole bunch of really terrible ones as well. Not that those are good, but there were lots of bad titles. And then we sort of like the theme of sticking with 3-word titles. It's a marketing decision, and anyone who tells you names and covers are not marketing decisions are probably not telling the truth. Either that, or they have full control over the process. And so I had a long chat with my Australian publisher about it had to be 3 words. It had to be simple and not give away anything in the story, and so on and so forth. So in the end, we just said, what about in the clearing? And it stuck, and the other territories, so the UK and US, liked it. So yeah, that's sort of how it came about. But if I had my way, yeah, it would be, I love the cover and I love the title, but it would have been different.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Can you give me any idea of what the new book that we'll be expecting in September is like, without giving too much away, obviously?
Absolutely. I mean, the cool thing about this book, and it's happened a little bit with my other books, but the cool thing about this book is my US publisher and my UK publisher are equally as excited as my Australian publisher. And that's not because it's set in the US or the UK, or that I've written for that market in particular, but it's because it's got that high concept, pitchable sort of, plot. And that is essentially the story opens with a man who is, he checks into an Airbnb, he goes to the key lock, gets the key out, drags the suitcase inside. But when he opens his suitcase, it's just full of power tools and small boxes. And when he opens those small boxes, there are tiny cameras inside. And he sets about installing tiny cameras in, the living room, the bedroom, the bathroom, kitchen. And so the concept of the story essentially is a couple they have money troubles, and they decide to rent their property on Airbnb. It's on a lake, it's like a lake house. And, they become because my wife and I actually did this. We rented our places on Airbnb for a period, and we used to always, whenever someone was about to check in, because you get their name and stuff, we'll be like, oh, I wonder what they're like. So we always check their reviews, and occasionally we'll just Google their name and then be like, oh, there's their LinkedIn. Okay, cool. He's an engineer, and, she's an accountant. And it's just sort of like mildly voyeuristic, and really kind of, you can only do this because we live in the digital age where people tend to put so much private information out there. So I thought, well, that's quite fun. What if they were sort of looking at these people, but they didn't realize that potentially someone was looking back out at them? And so it's sort of it's about voyeurism, but it's about, big tech and accountability. And there's a whole bunch of sort of uncomfortable questions in there about why we're so interested in things like Facebook and Twitter, and why sometimes late at night we might look up someone we went to school with just to see what they're doing. So it's a, yeah, like I said, a high concept story, really twisty. It's a thriller as well, and suspenseful. And yeah, like I said, if I can get these last few drafts right, hopefully it'll be a good read too.
All right. Now, the one thing I didn't hear that much about, as far as the plot goes, is your first novel, and you got a major literary prize for that, I believe, the Nagao Marsh Prize.
Yeah.
For first novel. Yeah, that was good. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, cool. So I'll also start with saying it did, in Australia and New Zealand, it was it wasn't necessarily a big hit, but it was a much bigger book over here. It was published with Putnam, which is part of the Penguin Random House Group in the States and the UK. But essentially, I mean, it was fun to write, and I think everyone has this where they'd go back and change certain things about certain books. And I love it as it is, but I did realize after it was published that it does suffer from that kind of thing of being not literary or not commercial, but and sort of sitting in the snowman's land. which is great for prizes. You know, it's great for literary prizes. It's great for winning sort of accolades or whatever. And so yeah, it's a story of basically a girl and a unknown person who arrive in a small beach town in New Zealand, which is my home country. And it's this place I wrote about was really close to me. It's called Makatu, and it was really close to me and dear to me all my life. Certainly as a teenager, I'd go over there quite often. I'd go surfing and stay in a friend's beach house, but it was also quite scary. And I think for anyone outside of that area of the country, it's a really sort of intimidating place, and the locals are quite taciturn. And so I thought, you know, we had some run-ins there quite often when we were younger, and I thought, what would happen if I sort of took a young woman from inner city Melbourne, which is very metropolitan, and deposited her in this place in the middle of nowhere, where the locals sort of nod their heads as a greeting and don't really, you know, and it is quite, it's stark and beautiful, but it's also quite rough and can be quite, you know, the sea can be quite rough, quite dangerous. And but what would happen if I put her there? How would she respond? What would the locals be like? And I thought, what would happen if she turned up and she had a shaved head, which would make her even more, you know, distinct and different to the area? So I sort of worked my way back from there, and that's how the story kind of emerged. But like I said, it was this. I'd say it's much more literary than In the Clearing, and there was a real focus on the character elements and sort of, you know, social media use and stuff like that. And I wanted to really write to that, and I wanted to, you know, showcase that part of New Zealand that never gets talked about or never gets exposed.
Yeah. You mentioned also that was a fairly easy book to write compared to In the Clearing. And we need to say, tell us what the name of that book is. I think it's Call Me Evie.
Call Me Evie, yeah. Call Me Evie is my first novel, yeah.
Okay, so why was that easy as compared to others?
Well, I'd say In the Clearing was the easiest, sorry, but I think Call Me Evie was much easier than The Last Guest because, well, I say it wasn't easy, but you're right, without expectation. I had written a number of short stories and articles and had a number of things published, but I didn't have a book deal. And so when you're writing like that, you write with absolute freedom. You don't really care for genres or micro genres, or in fact, you don't care for the end reader. You're sort of writing for yourself. And that's a completely different experience when you are contracted to produce another book, as I was. So my second book, you know, I didn't feel the pressure because I had already written that book before Call Me Evie came out. But in saying that, Evie came with no expectations whatsoever. By the time I'd sent it off to an agent, and my agent here in Australia had said, "Oh, great," you know. But by the time I got to that stage, I was certain of what the book was. Whereas with In the Clearing and The Last Guest, I sent it off with much more doubt, oddly enough, much less certainty, because I'm thinking, is this what they want? Is this what they expect? Because I have a publisher, I have an editor. But before that, I sent it to the agent without any expectation. I thought it'd get rejected. I didn't really care for it, you know. I just thought, oh, I'll put it out and see what happens. So yeah, it was. I think it's. I know. I mean, not many writers want to hear this, but before you are contracted to write a book, before you have a publishing history, you have absolute freedom, and you'll never have that again. There's always expectations and so on and so forth after that. So as much as it's a real slog, and as much as there's so much doubt about whether or not you'll even be published, you also have this sort of magical freedom, this thing that you can be any writer you want. And so that's why I think Evie was, one, more fun to write, but two, it wasn't so difficult to write in the end.
One thing I'd like you to do, because I've seen several of your programs that you've put on the net, and I enjoy them. You spend a lot of time and patience, I must say, giving tips to writers, giving advice. sometimes, and a deeper advice, I should say, than tips. So let's say that I had never written a book in my life, but I want to so badly, and I'm going to do it if it kills me. What would you tell me?
Well, I'm not going to say, I wouldn't say, I mean, sometimes I joke and say, oh, don't bother. And it's quite mean to say that, because obviously it's your dream and your hopes and stuff. So assuming, that you want to write for the right reasons, assuming that you want to publish and write novels for the right reasons, I would say the most practical and best piece of advice I could give in general. Sorry, my daughter's screaming. You can probably hear her, right?
Noticed.
Anyway, I would say the most, probably most generic, but also practical advice I could give is to fully understand that going from not published to published has a series of stepping stones, and you can be quite pragmatic about it. You're not necessarily going to sit down and write 70,000 words and send those 70,000 words off to a publisher and they're going to send back a 7-figure check. That happens one in 100 million. I don't know what it would be, but it would be so uncommon. Let's just discount that. So you have to write a number of drafts, a series of drafts, and there are going to be periods between when you send that to someone and when you hear back. So between those periods, I suggest try to get short stories published in literary magazines. Review other books, try to write reviews, even just pitch reviews to lit magazines or pitch reviews to blogs or whatever. Just move forward, if that makes sense. So try to move to those next steps, because you just write alone. Usually, even if you're in a writer's group, I wouldn't describe that necessarily as the highest quality feedback. What you want to do, the best feedback you can get is an editor of a literary magazine or a magazine or a newspaper, or just someone with some authority saying to you, this is good, it may not be there yet, keep at it. Then you've made progress, your writing is getting better. And then eventually you might keep writing enough and one day a review or something gets picked up, a short story gets picked up. Then you've got that validation. Then you're going to go through the editorial process, they'll give you feedback. And so it's all about sort of accumulating these small wins or stepping stones. And the entire time you can also be working on the novel. But I also think it's really important to try to engage the community and the writing community and the broader, world of literature and literary community. Try to engage that community in a way where you're going to get that feedback and you're going to grow and develop as a writer.
Okay. I think we're about to wind it up. Is there one final thing you'd like to say about In the Clearing and what you hope readers take away from that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for me, I think talking about themes is more for, your high school English classes and stuff like that. I think it's a myth that writers actually write to a theme. I think we do write and a theme might emerge, and then we'll tease that out and we'll interrogate it because it's something that interests us. And if there is a theme in this book, it's about family, and it's about, what constitutes a family, what we would do for our family. But I also want readers to ask why. What is it? There's this sort of biological imperative, but also what, if you're very close with someone, it's the same sort of bond. And so I sort of want people to think about family in a deeper way, and what family actually represents and means.
That's wonderful. So that has been Joshua Pomare, and his new book is called In the Clearing, one of the finest literary suspense novels I've read so far. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Betty. It's been fun.
Okay, bye-bye. Tell your daughter hi for me.
Will do.